Friday, July 7. Does Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 to 14 teach that God predetermines the futures of human beings, predestining some to everlasting life and others to everlasting death? Many people unfortunately believe this. Consider, however, these ideas. 1. In the passage, the role of Christ is determinative, since the divine choice to adopt us occurs through Jesus Christ in chapter 1, verse 5, or in him in verses 4 and 11. This suggests that God's election and predetermination are exercised toward all who choose faith in Christ, rather than selecting who will be saved or lost on a case-by-case basis even before people are born. God's decision is the studied, predetermined divine response to those who exercise faith in Christ. 2. Ephesians 1, 3 to 14 also contains vivid relational language about God's work of salvation. God is Father, and we are his adopted children, we read in verses 3 to 5, who receive his blessings in bountiful measure in verse 8. We must understand the language about God's choice and predetermination in the light of this rich relational language. God is not a distant, unfeeling judge who makes decrees from afar, but the caring Father of all his children, as we see in Ephesians 3:15, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named. 3. That God honours human choice is reflected in Ephesians 1, 3 to 14, especially verse 13, where hearing and believing are judged to be important. Elsewhere in the letter, in Ephesians 2:8 and Ephesians 3:17 and Ephesians 4:1 right through till chapter 6 and verse 20, all of which emphasize or presume the existence of choice and the response of faith. And in other passages in the New Testament, for example in 1 Timothy 2 and Acts 17, or as Ellen G. White expressed it in Steps to Christ, page 68, in the matchless gift of his Son, God has encircled the whole world with an atmosphere of grace as real as the air which circulates around the globe. All who choose to breathe this life-giving atmosphere will live and grow up to the stature of men and women in Christ Jesus. End of quote. And that brings us to our 3 discussion questions for this week. 1. What arguments would you add to those given above supporting the idea that God does not pick and choose before we have been created who will be saved and who will be lost? 2. Whose choice ultimately decides whether or not a person has salvation in Jesus? 3. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace, we read in Ephesians 1:7. How does this verse reveal the reality of salvation by faith alone and not by the works of the law? And for today's Inside Story, here's Sibylla. Thank you, Sibylla.
Remarkable Path to Lebanon by Kathy Lichtenwalter. Volunteer teacher Juan Oliveira struggled to listen to the speaker at an I Will Go mission training event at Middle East University in Beirut, Lebanon. Where have I seen that guy before, he wondered. Ruwan had arrived from Brazil to serve as a volunteer teacher at the Adventist Learning Center, which teaches Syrian refugee children in grades 1 to 8. He was listening to a university teacher, Brian Manley, describe the work of tent makers, Seventh-day Adventists who follow Apostle Paul's example of using their profession to work in non-Christian countries. Ruwan pulled out his cell phone and began to scroll through years of photos. Mission was in Ruwan's blood. Born in Brazil, he had grown up in a family that talked and lived mission. As a high school student, he accompanied his parents to Argentina for an I Will Go mission conference in 2017. His heart was deeply touched as he heard about the needs of the Middle East. During his first year of university studies, he accepted an invitation to teach English in a non-Christian country in Asia. Soon after he arrived, however, the language school closed. He stayed to study the local language, but he was forbidden from mentioning God to anyone. Returning to Brazil for his second year of university, Ruan felt a strong desire to go abroad again. He filled out several applications for openings in the Middle East, the region that had captured his imagination at the 2017 conference in Argentina. God, it's up to you, he prayed as he sent off the applications on vividfaith.com, the Adventist Church's official website for volunteers. I will accept the first response that I get. 7 minutes later, a message popped up on his phone. It was from the Adventist Learning Centre in Beirut. Ruan arrived at the school 6 weeks later. After Asia, he had an appreciation for the religious freedom in Lebanon. I can even tell them I am a Christian, he said. After a year in Lebanon, Ruan intends to finish his studies and become a full-time missionary. His conviction that God has called him was reaffirmed when he remembered where he had seen Brian Manley previously. After Manley finished speaking at the conference, Ruan approached him, phone in hand. I know where I've seen you before, he said, scrolling back 5 years to show a photo of him and his parents with Manley at the conference in Argentina in 2017. It was Manley's presentation about tent makers at the conference that had stirred Ruan's heart to serve God in the Middle East.